All right, we want to conclude just with a couple of further things about the portion of Torah that we refer to as Numbers. We completed last time the book as far as looking at the purpose and the structure, and seeing that in the middle of this section of the Torah is the great failure of Israel to obey Yahweh in faith. They refuse to go into the land. God disciplines them, but particularly what was seen in the oracles of Balaam is that God has not forgotten the promise that has been given to Abraham, and ultimately at the end of the days he is going to fulfill his promise to Abraham through the coming king. And we saw two echoes in Numbers chapter 23 and 24, to go back to Genesis chapter 49, the passage dealing with the ruler who will come out of Judah. And again, this is brought before Israel within the Torah as their ultimate hope. Certainly the Torah, like all of the Old Testaments, we can put it this way, is a messianic document, in the sense that in the end it points to God fulfilling his plan and purpose in this one who he is going to send in the future. Yet in the meantime, he has disciplined the first generation of Israel, and yet again he has shown his patience, he has shown his compassion in the fact that he has raised up a second generation of approximately the same number of people as the first generation. And as you come to the end of the book of Numbers, he will surely take them into the land. And we see a renewed measure of obedience on the part of the second generation, just as had been seen in the first generation, until they got back traveling in the wilderness, and the grumbling and the complaining and the rebellion that had been evident as they came out of Egypt is once again seen within their experience. Just a quick word, probably today, of all of the portions of the Torah, the one that is lacking in good resources is this section that is referred to as Numbers. When I first began teaching this 12 years ago, I would say that about Leviticus. Well, Leviticus, as we've seen, has now had some good works brought out explaining that book. And we need some of the same quality material as far as Numbers is concerned as well. But of the books that I list before you, to show you how well books on Numbers sell, Philip is now out of print. I leave him there because I have nothing really to replace him with, and if you take a look at the bargain page of CBD, you can still get some copies of Philip and the Christian Communicators series, but as soon as they're gone, they're gone. And I don't think there was enough copies sold that you're probably going to see it listed very much on eBay either, for those of you who try to pick up used books. Hopefully there'll be some expositional works that are coming out. Fortunately, in about 3 years ago, the work by Dennis Cole in the NAC, and you can star that. That today is the volume to get on the book of Numbers. Cole in the NAC. The NIC by Timothy Ashley is a good work. Like the NAC's, it puts its exegetical data in footnotes within at the bottom of the text. By the way, the NIC series puts the footnotes in the right place, at the bottom of the page where you can read them, instead of at the back where you have to go searching for the footnote. Well, there's just a little bit of my issue with publishers, and I know it's easier to do it the new-fashioned way, putting it at the back, but sure makes it a lot easier to read when it's at the bottom. Well, the NICs do it in the right way. They put them at the bottom, and Ashley's work is certainly a valuable and the best evangelical exegetical work in print today. But Cole, I think, surpasses him as far as giving a good exposition, not exposition so much as interpretation, a good explanation of the text. And prayerfully from that, you can work at developing your own exposition. Now, and I love talking to you during the breaks and after class and in the office around the campus. And it's great to have you reading the Old Testament and having many, many questions come into your mind, and seek to answer as many as possible that aren't in the notes. I would encourage you that if we don't deal with an interpretive issue within class, be sure to look up and at least see an abridgment of discussion that is in the study notes. A couple of you said, I could, I guess, read the note in the study Bible, couldn't I? And, well, yes, because basically the answer I would give you is in the note in the study Bible. But obviously, with time, we can only take a look at so many interpretive issues. So I certainly give you that encouragement that as you have questions from the text, and I'm not requiring you to read those notes, but you might want to go ahead and see what Dr. MacArthur has to say about the text that you have questions about. But one further issue we want to deal with, in Numbers, we talked about the structure of the book is a great issue, and the greatest issue is the numbers that are in the text. I did talk to Dr. Barrick after our discussion, and he will deal with the issue again of numbers in OTI, but he deals with them in Samuel, not Numbers. So he was glad to know we had an extensive discussion of that, and he said, "Did you tell him about David Fout's article?" I said, "Yes, I did." He said, "Good. They're ready for me then when I get them in OTI." And he'll talk again about the issue of numbers in the Old Testament, but he will deal with it in the book of Samuel. But another issue that, and this is more of probably a lay issue, as you can see, most of the commentators take the right answer because the right position is B there within the biblical text. But when you read Numbers, and lay people are going to come to you because they want to know some things about this man Balaam. And why, in the end, did God use such a scoundrel as this man? And how are we to understand him from the biblical text? And even some liberal scholars say, no matter what the rest of the Bible has to say, that here in Numbers, Balaam is brought before us within this text as a true prophet of Yahweh. Now, it is true that in chapters 23 and 24, because Yahweh has confronted Balaam with the fact, you're going to speak and speak only what I tell you to say, that his oracles in chapter 23 and 24 are exactly what God wanted said. They are God's word. But God's word through a very, very unlikely source, because the rest of the Old, and particularly into the New Testament, makes it very, very clear that Balaam was a false prophet. When you get to 2 Peter and Jude, Balaam is an example of the false, in the Old Testament, of the false prophets that mirror false teachers that have come into the church. And Numbers certainly shows us, and is picked up within those passages, that Balaam basically was one who taught, one who spoke for whatever God, as long as the price was right. His God was money. He loved to get the the monetary reward of his teaching. And certainly when you get to the book of Revelation, Jesus Christ himself in chapter 2 verse 14 talks about those who erred in the same way as Balaam. Now you don't have to wait until you get to the New Testament. If you read carefully Numbers chapter 22, you will note that the text makes it very, very clear that no matter what Balaam says, he does not have an intimate relationship with Yahweh. Notice as we pick up the text in Numbers chapter 22, that when the elders of Moab and Midian come to Balaam and repeat Balak's words to him, he said to them, verse 8, this is Balaam speaking, "Spend the night here, and I will bring word to you as Yahweh may speak to me." All right, you've brought your request. I will communicate with Yahweh and see what Yahweh says to me. But in verse 9, it is not Yahweh who comes to Balaam, it is God. It is Elohim who comes to Balaam and said, "Who are these men with you?" And God says in verse 12, "Do not go with them. You shall not curse the people, for they are blessed." Now in verse 13, Balaam continues to speak as though he has this intimate relationship with Yahweh. "Go back, for Yahweh has refused to let me go with you." Now, what Moses is doing here, directed by the Spirit of God, is saying, yes, Yahweh is the one communicating to Balaam, but he's communicating to Balaam not as Yahweh, but as Elohim, the great and powerful God of creation. He is relating to Balaam as a created being, not as one who is in an intimate relationship with him as was Israel through Yahweh's deliverance and redemption. Even when they come back the second time, and notice in verse 18, Balaam says, "I could not do anything either great or small contrary to the command of Yahweh my God." He is claiming once again to have a personal relationship with Yahweh, but once again, verse 20, it is God came to Balaam at night and said, "If the men have come to call you, rise up and go with them, but only the word which I speak to you shall you do." All right, Balaam, I know you really want to go, particularly now that the ante has been upped. Very simply, that is seen because he comes and pleads, with the Lord another time, and God allows him to go. And then we see that on Balaam's point, there is no intimate relationship with Yahweh, because when the angel of Yahweh stands before him as he's going on the way, his donkey is able to recognize Yahweh, and Balaam is not. That should be the culminating. And if you haven't read it closely to that point, this should really, speak the final word to you. Balaam does not have a personal relationship with Yahweh. He doesn't even know that Yahweh is there. He takes his frustration out on his donkey. And of course the donkey speaks to him, and the greater miracle is that Balaam speaks to the donkey. He carries on a conversation with his donkey. So who is the biggest fool within this, context? And then Yahweh, the angel of the Lord, opens Balaam's eyes to be able to appreciate what has taken place. Verse 31, "Then Yahweh opened the eyes of Balaam, and he saw the angel of the Lord standing in the way." And it's only at that point that Balaam comes now and has a personal knowledge of Yahweh and realizes he had sinned. Again, verse 35, go with the men, but you shall speak only the word which I shall tell you. And it is very, very interesting in verse 38. He says, the word that God puts in my mouth, I will speak. Notice he's not making any claims now about Yahweh being his God. All right? Yahweh has communicated to me. And now what? The sovereign, powerful God will tell me to say, that is what I will say. Did this convert Balaam? And when you get to chapter 31, verse 16, the answer is no. It did not create a permanent change. Balaam never became a worshiper of Yahweh. Now, under Yahweh's strong hand, this is getting back like Pharaoh. Balaam acts as God wants him to act under his strong hand. But there is no change of heart. Because in chapter 31 we see where Israel is commanded by the Lord spoke to Moses, verse 1, saying, take full vengeance for the sons of Israel on the Midianites. They had joined with the Moabites in seeking to curse Israel. Therefore, God directs them to go to war against these. And notice in 31:16, and this is a further reason, because they, under the counsel of Balaam, sought to lead Israel into a curse through the matter of Peor, what is recorded in Numbers chapter 25. Behold, these caused the sons of Israel through the counsel of Balaam to trespass against Yahweh in the matter of Peor. What we pick up in 31:16 is that after Balaam had given these words of blessing upon Israel, he gets the Moabites and Midianites and says, now I've had to speak a word of blessing, but let me give you some counsel. Let me give you some advice in how you can bring judgment, how you can bring a plague upon Israel. And that is, you seduce them into your idolatrous practice through immorality. And so this counsel came from Balaam. And in the end of the day, he is with the Midianites in chapter 31, verse 8, and is killed with them in this act of vengeance. So not only the Midianites, but also Balaam, who has given this counsel to them, is also put to death. So not only a reading of chapter 22, but also a reading here in Numbers chapter 31 makes it very, very clear that Balaam is a false prophet. Even though he claims and states, Yahweh my God, I have communicated, I have spoken to Yahweh, this is what Yahweh has said to me, that he did not have an intimate relationship with Yahweh as a prophet, yet as a false prophet under the strong hand of God. For 2 chapters, he speaks the truth. But his life before and his life after was not one of truth speaking for Yahweh. It was one of antagonism against him. And I would not go along with Ashley that Balaam's character is incidental to the narrative. I think Balaam's character is very germane to the narrative. Now, why does God use Balaam? Well, this is, as we have seen, at the end of the section of Numbers that has spoken about Israel's disobedience. They have been disobedient in chapter 21. They will be disobedient again in chapter 25. We have the fiery serpents in chapter 21. We have the plague because of the immorality, the adultery, and the spiritual adultery with Baal that is given to us in Numbers chapter 25. And why Balaam? And, also at that point, Moses has also just rebelled against Yahweh as well. And so what the Lord does, therefore, is not reaffirm his blessing upon Israel from within Israel, but from this false Gentile prophet, diviner, from outside of Israel at this point, speaking to him the truth. In other words, he uses a disobedient man to communicate God's truth about his disobedient people within the context of Numbers 20 through 25, and actually going back all the way to chapter 11 to chapter 25. And yet, as we've already seen, Balaam is raised up, and yet in the end, Balaam dies. And as opposed to Jacob and later on Moses, he does not die in faith. He dies in rebellion against Yahweh. So his character is not incidental in the narrative. It's very much a part of the narrative. And the text doesn't give a neutral judgment upon Balaam. It gives a negative judgment upon Balaam. Well, preaching Numbers. Obviously, there are still aspects of the law. We're getting close to the Deuteronomy where we'll talk about that, the law and preaching the law. But also within Numbers, again, we hit narrative, particularly in chapters 11 to 25. And a lot like we talked about Leviticus, that as you get into Hebrews, you can take an excursus and do 4 or 5 messages on Leviticus. The same would be true if you were going through 1 Corinthians, and particularly in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, where it talks about the rebellion of Israel being an example to us who live this side of the cross. And a couple of the incidents from Numbers are mentioned there, and you might want to expand that again and take an excursus and to spend a number of weeks going through the growing rebellion of Israel, how it began with the complaining, the weeping, the grumbling, that becomes out and out rebellion, resistance against what God has said. And of course, how what is seen in Numbers 11 to 25 is certainly beyond the examples that Paul himself brings up, is a great illustration to us this side of the cross of not grumbling and complaining, because of how when we grumble and complain against the Lord, how that can grow and manifest itself in human pride and rebellion against God. So he who stands, take heed lest he fall. And that principle that is enunciated in 1 Corinthians 10, you can do an excursus and use that principle and take a number of weeks and go through the central part of Numbers and show how that principle certainly works out within these chapters. And be very, very careful. And be very careful because it begins with grumbling. And I say that as a grumbler speaking to grumblers. We are very, very quick. We live in a culture that has told us have it your way. Everything revolves around you. You are the most important person on the face of the earth. Because of that, we are very, very quick when things don't go our way to complain. And I do it, you do it. I mean, some of you will do it tomorrow. The coach will pick the wrong play at the end of the game and your team will lose. I've had to come to realize victories and defeats are within the sovereignty of God. I can't continue to grumble about what happened. And I try not to. My son last night he has one of these, NFL 204 Madden football games. He was grumbling because the play went against him on a computer game. I said, son, it's bad enough to grumble when it's a real game. This is all make-believe, and you're grumbling because you're losing. This is, but it's just an indication of the culture we live in. All right, so point out that these are serious matters, and we live in a day, and you're going to be ministering to people whose first response is when everything goes wrong is to complain. I did it last night, so I'm guilty of what I'm telling you. Complain to the guys who put the numbers on the street, saying, hey, the last time you did it wasn't very, very good. Well, I guarantee you're going to give me this time. Well, they did. They were very, very kind. But I let them know that I was disappointed in the previous job. And then my wife said, oh, boy, you were sure in a good mood with them, weren't you? How'd you like to give those guys a tract and say, would you like to trust the Lord as your Savior? Touche. Guilty. So as I said, as grumblers talking to grumblers. The middle part of Numbers has a very pertinent application. And so don't neglect preaching it, and you can do it within as I said, the context of 1 Corinthians. Because probably it's going to be a while before you get to preaching Numbers as an exposition within its own right. Well, moving in then to Deuteronomy. And Deuteronomy is universally agreed today to be the most important section of the Old Testament. Conservative and liberal alike. Deuteronomy is the culmination of the Torah, and in culminating the Torah, it becomes the foundation of language and thought throughout the rest of the Old Testament and into the New Testaments. When the Torah is quoted within the New Testament, the predominant part of the Torah quoted is Deuteronomy. It's very quickly brought up that in the narration of Jesus' temptation in Matthew 4 and Luke 4, that Jesus resists the temptation of the devil by using words that are in and recorded in this culminating part of the Torah that we refer to as Deuteronomy. And in fact, in the past, we've actually had a THM seminar that has talked about the influence of the theology and language of Deuteronomy in the rest of the Old Testament. This is very, very pertinent. If there is a part of the Old Testament to give concentrated study, and if there is a part of the Torah that you should preach fairly early within your ministry, it is Deuteronomy. It is this part of the Torah. Now, in introduction, the Hebrew title goes back to the first statement, these are the words, which is a much more accurate title than the misnomer of this being a second law. There is no second law in Deuteronomy. It is a reiteration and explanation of the first law. So, I don't like the name Deuteronomy. It comes from a misunderstanding of Deuteronomy chapter 17, where the future king is commanded to write a copy of the law on a scroll in the presence of a Levitical priest. He is to write the law, the Torah, so that he might have it, so that he might read it and learn to fear the Lord. Now, all of Israel was going to hear it, Sabbath by Sabbath, culminating in hearing it on the Feast of Tabernacles of the sabbatical year. But the king was to be governed by Torah, ruled by Torah. And so he was to have his own copy and make his own copy. And notice he shall write for himself a copy. Now, many take that metaphoric. It could be very, very literal. The king is to literally make his own copy of Torah, which means the king was to be able to read and write, to be taught to read and write, and to make a copy that would be his own, and then he was to read it, he was to learn it, and he was to follow it. Now, in the Septuagint, instead of making a copy of this law, it said he's to make himself a second law on a scroll. Deuteronomos. And because of that mistranslation, the whole book within the Septuagint, through the Vulgate into English, has become known as the second law. But in the original Hebrew, there's no concept here that a second law is being written. He is writing the law. He is writing the ordinance and the commandments and the stipulations that were given at Sinai, and how those stipulations were explained and applied to the second generation of Israel within the book of Deuteronomy. There is not a second covenant, there is not a second law that is embodied within Deuteronomy. It is only a reiteration of that which had been stated previously. And we'll see a little bit more than that, because Moses is going to say, now I've made it very, very clear to you exactly what God requires of you, and you're going to go in the land and disobey. Even though I made it that clear. You've been rebels while I've been with you. You're going to be even greater rebels after I am gone. But my words go with you into the land. There is no excuse. You know exactly what God requires of you. Now, as far as the date of events, there are some events that are recorded here. Obviously, it begins with Moses gathering all Israel and speaking to them. So we see in 1:1, these are the words which Moses spoke to all Israel across the Jordan in the wilderness, that is the east side of the Jordan, as they have come from Horeb to Kadesh Barnea, and from Kadesh Barnea they have now come to the plains of Moab. And this is after they had won the victory over the Canaanite kings within the eastern area to the east of Jordan. And he began this and speaks to them gathers them on the first day of the 11th month. That is, of the 40th year after the Exodus, the last month of Moses' life, because he's going to die in chapter 34 and be mourned for 30 days by Israel. That's in chapter 34, verse 8. But when you get to Joshua, Moses is dead, and the people are ready to go into the land. They do so, and as they're in the land, in chapter 5, they celebrate the Passover, which was on the 14th day of the first month. So by Joshua 5, we are into the first month and only halfway into that month. 2 weeks into the first month. So that Moses' death, it is assumed, takes place toward the end of the 11th month. And during most, if not all, of the 12th month is when these 30 days they mourn. And then Joshua picks up the story and gives the events that take place in the first month of the 41st year as Israel goes into the land. And so this is Moses giving his final words. We've had the final words of Jacob in chapter 49 of Genesis. These are Moses' final words to the nation of Israel. And takes place basically all that is written, the speeches, and the narrative around it basically takes place in a month period. Then Moses dies, and then we're into the events that will take place in the book of Joshua. Now, as we get into Deuteronomy, what are some of the major themes that emerge? And as we get into the book, first is what I would call Moses making clear God's choice of Israel. Basically communicating to the people, you are not here by accident. You are here because of God's choice. And I listed as the second theme, God is a choosing God. And if you like the theological term, God is a God of election. Yahweh's choice. Yahweh's choice of Israel. Because of their relationship with the fathers. 437, and this is reiterated again in chapter 7 and 12, 14. Because he loved your fathers, therefore he chose their seed after them. And he personally brought you from Israel by his great power, driving out before you nations greater and mightier than you, to bring you in to give you their land for an inheritance as it is today. Well, continuing on, therefore know today and take it to your heart that Yahweh, he is God in heaven above and on earth below. There is no other. And certainly that is also a theme that is echoed throughout Deuteronomy as well, that there's no one else like Yahweh. And Yahweh is your God, and Yahweh only, and you are to follow him and serve him alone, because he is the one true God, and he is your God. And why is he your God? Because he chose you. And how did he choose you? He chose you because you are the seed of the patriarchs to whom he has given promises. And he has personally acted to bring you out of Egypt and to give you victory over your enemies to this day as you've experienced it, and will take you in and give you the land as an inheritance as he promised to the patriarchs. Why are you God's people? He chose you. Why are you here, prepared to go into this land? Because he chose you as the seed of Abraham to be the means to bring about the fulfillment of his promise that he gave to the patriarchs. Your past, your present, your future is determined by the fact that Yahweh has chose you. And as you go into the land as God's chosen people, God is going to choose a place for his name to dwell. God now resided among them, as we've seen, at the tabernacle, and that tabernacle, that place of God's presence, is going to be given a permanent place once they're in the land. God is going to ultimately make it clear where his name is to dwell. So chapter 12, verse 4 and 5, you shall not act like this toward the Lord your God. That is through the idolatrous altars, the idols and altars you're going to find within the land. Destroy all that Canaanite religious paraphernalia. But you shall seek Yahweh at the place which Yahweh your God shall choose from all your tribes to establish his name there for his dwelling, and there you shall come. So just as you have come in the wilderness to the tabernacle, God is going to choose a place for his name to dwell when you come into the land. He will choose it. And that is the place you are to come to worship him. You cannot worship him anywhere, and certainly not use the altars and the idols that are in the land left by the Canaanites. The king was to be chosen by Yahweh. In fact, Israel was to realize that Yahweh would choose the king. In 17:15, you shall surely choose a king over you whom Yahweh your God chooses. Just tuck that in your back of your mind. We'll come to that when we get to 1 Samuel chapter 8. And following. God made it very, very clear there would be a king, but it would be the king of his choice. And then also the priests. The priests from the tribe of Levi. God has chosen him and his sons from all your tribes to stand and serve in the name of Yahweh forever. 18:5 and again in 21:5. God is a choosing God, and he has chosen Israel. And therefore, because God has chosen Israel, throughout the book, predominantly, Moses keeps referring to Yahweh, your God. Now, a number of times, he will include himself. Approximately, as you go through, about 24 times. But 280 times he will speak about Yahweh, your God. Yahweh, your God. Yahweh, your God. He has chosen you. You are now his people. Choice was based upon the patriarchs. You're their seed. And all this chart does is go through and just reiterate for you again and again in each section of Deuteronomy the emphasis upon Yahweh your God, Yahweh your God, Yahweh your God. You get to the end of Deuteronomy, and with this ringing in your ears, there's no way you can say Yahweh is not our God. It's Yahweh our God, Yahweh our God. And certainly the truth about Yahweh is revealed within the book. So I'm just going to leave it at that the chart you can just go through and see in numbers and numbers and numbers of contexts how Moses emphasizes to Israel that Yahweh was your God. And then finally throughout the book, Israel is referred to as all Israel. As all the men of Israel, all the tribes of Israel, all the assembly of Israel, all the elders of Israel. That what is given within Deuteronomy is for every last person within Israel. All of Israel is gathered. All of Israel hears. All of Israel is to respond. Now, obviously, they respond as individuals. But we see in the very introduction, Moses called all Israel, 5:1. Moses summoned all Israel and said to them. In chapter 11, verse 6, where he speaks about what he did to Dathan and Abiram, the son of Reuben, when the earth opened up, and those who followed them from among Israel. All right, so Israel is to be and was, dealt with at that point by the Lord. Then all Israel, verse 11 of chapter 13, will hear and be afraid and never do that. So, this instruction, as God has given to Israel throughout the Torah, culminating in Deuteronomy, is for all the people. There is no one who is left out. All the men, all the tribes, all the assembly are to hear what Yahweh says through Moses to his chosen people. Now, as we said, there is this emphasis upon Yahweh is your God. Yahweh is our God. And so throughout the book, there is a sustained speaking of attributes of Yahweh. And in fact, and I ask you this within the synopsis question, have to pay very careful attention as you go through Deuteronomy to what does Moses reveal concerning Yahweh. If you haven't picked it up implicitly from Genesis to Numbers, you cannot miss explicitly in Deuteronomy the revelation of who Yahweh is. And if you have not picked it up as you've gone through the rest of Torah, these speeches of Moses certainly lays upon Israel exactly what their response is to be to Yahweh. If this is your God, and he is, and your God has these attributes, then this is the way in which you are called to respond. And yet, over it all is a cloud, because every speech of Moses concludes with a statement that Israel has not, is not, and will not respond to what is being communicated to them. Yesterday in chapel, you were encouraged to think about Jeremiah. Whenever you want to start complaining, there comes that word again, grumbling upon how hard it is to preach to the people God has given to you, remember Jeremiah. Could I say before that, remember the example of the first great expository preacher of Scripture, Moses, here at the end of Torah. He is the first expositor of Scripture, right here, explaining what God had revealed previously, and now making it clear and giving explanation to Israel. And yet, as he is explaining, every one of his speeches is going to have to culminate with, and I know you're not going to listen. I know you're not going to hear. I know that you are not going to obey. Because in Deuteronomy 4, the curses are going to come upon you. Deuteronomy 27, 28, the curses are going to come upon you. Chapter 29, after the curses have come upon you, this is what Yahweh is going to do. Chapter 31, I know after I leave, you're going to do worse than what you did even when I was with you. And you just read Numbers. And you say, I can't get any worse than that. Well, come back starting next week for Joshua and on. It's going to be worse than what you've read so far in the Torah. You know, cheer up. It gets worse as you go through the rest of the Old Testament. I should say cheer up. Sorrow. Sober. That's right. And so Moses pours out his heart, explaining and pleading, exhorting the people. And yet through it all knowing it's going to fall on deaf ears. Because Moses is also the first prophet. And knows that ultimately his words will not be heard by that generation, but will be heard in a future generation. And we'll come back and talk about that when we get into the prophets as well. that they might be rejected in their own generation. But God will certainly change the heart of Israel in the future, so they finally will respond and obey. By the way, Israel still, though they pride themselves as being followers of Moses, they still are not followers of Moses. For the end of John chapter 5, if you believed Moses, said Jesus, you would what? You believe me. And since you disobey Moses, if you don't hear Moses, there is no faith toward Messiah. But that will change. That's also within the Torah. But we'll get to that next time when we take a look at Deuteronomy chapter 30. All right, the attributes of Yahweh. And 5 come before us in the book of Deuteronomy because of how many times they are stated within the text. We've already, brought up that as you go through the text, Yahweh is the unique and only God. There is no one like Yahweh. We saw that even in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 39. And I didn't even list that. I mean, I didn't list every last verse where this is brought up. But truly, as you go through the text and the overarching text that brings this before Israel is a great passage in chapter 6, particularly in verses 4 and 5. Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is our God. Yahweh is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And even though there is, exegetical discussion on exactly how this is to be understood, this statement in verse 4, the conclusion of every position is that it is stating the uniqueness and the exclusivity of Yahweh. And Yahweh is Israel's one and only God. And again, you notice how even here, with the revelation of Yahweh in verse 4, verse 5, and you shall have a corresponding response. That as you go through Deuteronomy, you see that when Yahweh is revealed, that immediately or somewhere within the greater context of the statement being made, there is also a call to Israel to bring proper response to the attribute of Yahweh that is being revealed. And so he is unique, and because of that, because he is one, he is a zealous and jealous God. When his people turn and embrace other gods in his place. And in fact, this is spiritual adultery. It is the same kind of jealousy that a man has for his wife. All right, this is a unique relationship. Here is your man. Here is the one and only. And then when a woman would turn away to other men, the jealousy of the husband is provoked. Well, this is an indication within human affairs of what really begins with Yahweh. And Yahweh is the one unique and only God, and he is jealous. And he is, as Deuteronomy 4:24 says, a consuming fire, a jealous God. He has a jealousy that his people would worship and respond, serve him, and serve him only. Jealous in that sense. And it flows from his uniqueness. It flows from his unique status as being the only true God and being Israel's God. He's a God who had been faithful to Israel, that he watched over and fulfilled his word to them. So, for instance, in chapter 2, verse 7, Yahweh your God has blessed you in all that you have done. He has known your wanderings through this great wilderness. These 40 years, Yahweh your God has been with you, and you have not lacked a thing. God has faithfully taken care of you through the 40 years that you have been in the wilderness. He is a faithful God. He is a good God. And out of his faithfulness comes his provision for his people. He is a loving God, a God who, as we've already seen, set his love upon Israel because they were the seed of the fathers to whom he had given promises. And the Lord did not set his love, and this is very important, love within the Old Testament and the New Testament is an attribute of volition, not of mere emotion. God chose to love. He set his love. He willed to consider Israel as that which is honored in his eyes. And in Deuteronomy 7:7, love is tied in with choosing. And this is seen within the Old Testament, that you choose to set your affections upon one you have chosen to be your own. And that is the response of Yahweh. Yahweh is a loving God, and seen in his relationship with the people. He is a gracious God. And Moses will repeat this again and again and again, and how God had, in faithfulness and grace, responded. He multiplied the people, even in spite of Israel's disobedience to him. He'd been faithful to the patriarchs, even though, as we've already seen in Genesis, the patriarchs fail him. He's a gracious God. But he's also a God of judgment. He's also a God who takes sin into account and acts accordingly when his people fail. And so here is Yahweh, and along with the Psalms and with Isaiah, these are the high points of Scripture where the attributes of Yahweh are revealed. And of course, all Psalms and Isaiah does is go back and pick up the language of the Torah that is seen here in Deuteronomy, and just expands and applies them obviously within Israel's worship and Psalms, and with Isaiah bringing forth how can you be rebellious. And we're going to see that rebellion is a key term within Isaiah as well. How can you be rebellious against a God who has these attributes and these characteristics? How can you say that Yahweh doesn't know, Yahweh doesn't see, Yahweh doesn't care? And we'll come back to that as we get into Isaiah. But those are the three portions, and probably the key books within the Old Testament. The Torah as a whole, but particularly as we've seen, Deuteronomy, Psalms, and Isaiah play very important roles. Isaiah being the first of the latter prophets, the Psalms being the first of the writings, Torah being the Deuteronomy being the culmination of the Torah. And these are the three major portions of the Old Testament quoted within the New Testament. If you really want to know the Old Testament, then spend time analyzing Deuteronomy, Psalms, and Isaiah. And it's interesting that our Old Testament department, offers exegesis courses in what part of the Old Testament? Deuteronomy, Psalms, Isaiah. Oh, and also Genesis 1 to 11, which is also pretty vital as well. That begins the Torah. So the beginning of the Torah, the ending of the Torah. That's the four portions of the Old Testament that our Old Testament department has said are vital as far as offering exegesis courses. And I would certainly encourage you to take one, if not all, of those exegesis courses. And you're probably picking up, and Dr. Grisanti has not told me I have to say this, but I say it every year. If I could choose one out of those four, I would have you do Deuteronomy. I think it's foundational to what is in the other exegesis courses, and vital for you to get to know this portion of the Torah. Well, commercial aside, back to this course, the requirements of Israel. All right, we've already seen that. All right, there is to be a corresponding response on the part of Israel. This is who Yahweh is. And just as chapter 6, verse 4 is a key verse that brings before us the importance of knowing the attribute and character of Yahweh, and gives us the key that certainly this is to be seen within this portion of the Torah. Same thing in chapter 10, verse 12 and 13. That here Moses summarizes, and you will note as I talk about the requirements of Israel, I give 6, and the first 5 really flow out because they're what is stated here in the summary. When Moses says, "And now Israel, what does Yahweh your God require from you? But to fear Yahweh your God, to walk in all his ways and love him, and serve Yahweh your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to keep Yahweh's commandments and his statutes, which I am commanding you today for your good." These commandments are to your benefit, for your good. And so this is what Yahweh requires. And he uses terms that are very, very vital. To fear Yahweh, to hold him in awe, an awe that will lead you to subject yourself to him. That you'll be so overwhelmed by the greatness of Yahweh that you will submit to him. And as you can see, I've listed for you numbers of verses beginning in chapter 1 all the way to 31, where Moses will reiterate the importance of Israel fearing Yahweh, learning to fear him, learning as they hear and learn of who he is and his greatness, that there would be fear. And so the fear of Yahweh. I don't have these in the same order as here, but the third thing that he says is, and to love him. Right? In the same way that Yahweh has set his affection upon Israel, Israel is by volition to make a decision, a choice to set their affection upon Yahweh. And of course, Yahweh and Yahweh alone. And so they are to love Yahweh. They are to keep his commandments. That is, to obey the requirements that God has imposed upon them. And again, this concept of keeping his commandments is given again and again throughout Deuteronomy. They are to walk in Yahweh's ways. That is, they are to conduct their lives. Their behavior pattern is to conform to what Yahweh has said. And Yahweh has revealed his ways within the Torah. And Deuteronomy summarizes that and summarizes what the will of Yahweh is for Israel, and Israel is to conduct their lives accordingly. They are, along with that, to serve Yahweh. To serve Yahweh. That is, and serve is many times used within the Torah to speak about serving Yahweh vis-a-vis serving the idols. This is how it's going to be picked up as you go through the rest of the Old Testament. Serving Yahweh has the idea to have Yahweh as the central focus of one's life and one's worship. You follow him. You serve. You walk. Well, walking is your behavior, but basically the walking flows out of the fact that Yahweh is central in the thinking and central in the mind of Israel. Serve him. And then it's not said here, but again and again throughout Deuteronomy, Moses will call Israel to hear. Now, hear doesn't mean, all right, hear, so you can take a test and say, yeah, all right, I heard the words and I'm able to write them down. No, hear in the sense of hearken, obey. Hear in the sense of taking note, that you will respond in a positive way to what Yahweh is communicating through these speeches of Moses. And so, and you can go through, and the synopsis paper will allow you to spend a little bit of time going through these passages throughout the book of Deuteronomy and saying, look how Yahweh reveals himself and how he calls for a corresponding response on the part of his people. As you go through, you realize that God has set before Israel the land. The focus of the book from beginning to end is now the fact that Israel is poised and ready to go into the land. So that in chapter 1, Moses speaks about verse 8, relating what Yahweh said at Horeb, at Sinai. See, I've placed the land before you. Go in and possess the land which the Lord swore to give to your fathers. Right? And so this is the focus, and how God had faithfully brought them to the plains of Moab, and now on the plains of Moab. All right, let me reiterate, let me explain what God requires of you as you go into the land. Basically, even as you come to the end of the book, as we've already spoken about, that Moses even talks about what is going to take place as they go into the land. But in Deuteronomy 31:23, he commissioned Joshua and said, be strong and courageous, for you shall bring the sons of Israel into the land, which I swore to them, and I will be with you. And so here is Joshua, we've already seen, selected, chosen, set apart to lead Israel into the land after the death of Moses. So from beginning to end, as you're reading the speeches of Moses, you realize that the thrust is because Israel is now prepared to go into the land. And then finally, and we've already stated this as you go through the book, there is a cloud. Moses is going to die. I already know that from the narrative that precedes this. But Moses, on a number of times, reminds the people he is going to die. Even though he had pled with the Lord and sought the Lord to reverse the decision, he will not do so. And so Joshua is going to be raised up to take Moses' place and lead the people into the land. And so definitely you pick up, as you're going through Deuteronomy, this this theme of Moses is speaking his last words before he dies so that Israel might be prepared unto Joshua to go into the land. That this is the historical background. This is the historical situation as Moses is speaking these words. Well, with these themes, we come to purpose and structure, and that leads us down to the first interpretive issue, because even though there is unanimous agreement on the importance of Deuteronomy, there is not unanimity as far as the purpose and the structure of the book is concerned. Now let me take this historically and really begin with position D that is reflected in the commentary of Kyle and Kyle Dalich, also reflected in a more liberal work, but the old ICC volume by Driver. And that is, by the way, that's a work also like Kyle and Dalich that is now 100 years old and continues on in print to this day. It's expensively in print through T&T Clark, Driver's work. So if you're looking at eBay and see a used copy of Driver at a good price, it is well worth having, not because of his conclusions, but because so much of the exegetical data that is given to you in Driver's commentary on Deuteronomy. But I'll list here Kyle, much more conservative commentary that I recommended you also get. And both of these men, toward the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, with Driver, said that the purpose of Deuteronomy is to give a record of the speeches of Moses that explain and call for obedience to the Mosaic covenant, the one law that was revealed at Sinai. And the purpose of Deuteronomy is where we have Moses imploring, explaining, and then imploring. You have the true exposition, you have explanation and exhortation based upon what had been revealed by God at Sinai. And so this is the way in which the book of Deuteronomy really has classically been understood both in Jewish and Christian literature. Yet as we come into the 20th century, and through the archaeological finds that have come about, and particularly beginning in 1907, with the emergence through archaeological discovery of material from the Hittites. Hittites were the people who lived in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, the central Anatolia plateau, who during the middle to latter part of the second millennium BC were the second major power within the ancient Near East, along with Egypt, and actually spread their control and their sovereignty into the northern part of Levant and into the northern part of Mesopotamia. And the Hittites, when they would conquer a people, they would give a treaty to them, what has become known as the Hittite suzerainty treaties. They were the suzerain, they were the king, they were the masters, and the vassals were to respond properly, and a treaty was given by the Hittites. And they had a very profound and precise way of giving these treaties from them as the conqueror, and there was, there was no choice on the part of the vassal. Don't get the idea that the treaty was offered to the conquered peoples and say, here, will you accept this? It was given on, you're conquered, you will accept it. All right, and yet a copy will be left with you. We will have a copy, and this will be what basically structures our relationship together. We as the conquerors and you as the conquered. It was with the publication of these treaties that took place in the period between World War I and World War II that in the 50s, beginning with a man by the name of George Mendenhall. George Mendenhall, who's still alive actually today, published a number of articles saying that as you read these Hittite treaties in structure and even in some of the terminology, you have a reflection in the Old Testament of what is in these Hittite treaties. This was brought into evangelical thought by Meredith Kline in a work in the early 60s where he spoke about Deuteronomy as the treaty of the great king. That was the title of the book. And what Merrill did was take Deuteronomy and seek to show, based upon the archaeological finds, Mendenhall's articles, on how the structure and therefore the purpose of Deuteronomy was reflected back in these Hittite treaties. And and Kline was right on this, since Deuteronomy is not a second law. Sorry to keep bringing this up, but you can realize I don't think it's a good title. Because it's not a second law, it is just a reiteration, a renewal of the law made at Sinai, because the treaty actually, chapters 20 to 24, is seen made at Sinai, and now it is renewed with the second generation on the plains of Moab. And so he talked about this as the treaty of the great king. This is the renewal of the treaty, the covenant, with the second generation. This was refined and brought in to mainstream evangelical exegesis by, and I will use this term, the great commentary by Peter Craigie on the book. Craigie's commentary, the NIC series, has been the most definitive work on Deuteronomy of the previous generation. To show you how great an impact even liberals read and interact with Peter Craigie out of a very, very conservative commentary series. And though Craigie falls short of full affirmation of Mosaic authorship of Deuteronomy, he's certainly on the basis and uses this treaty formula that we're going to get to in just a second, apologetically to say that Deuteronomy in its present form has to emerge as a written document somewhere toward the end of the second millennium BC. He is a late dater as far as the Exodus, but he affirms that Deuteronomy is a second millennium BC document, and basically the liberals have to read it and put up with it, because he marshals the evidence from these treaties. It says basically in language and structure, because then the form is not known within the first century, and really sets the liberal ideas of source criticism somewhat upon its ear. And though liberals do not credit him with that, they certainly say, well, the commentary is an excellent work and has tremendous insights. And you should have a copy. It is the most, probably at this point, Craigie's commentary on Deuteronomy is the most influential commentary on any book of the Old Testament. And so you should read it, certainly interact with it. And his basic position is followed in Exposited Bible Commentary and the Bible Knowledge Commentary. Now, okay, let me, before I continue the history, what was this treaty formula? What was found within these Hittite documents of the second millennium BC? Well, on page 86 of Walton, and he follows the basic understanding that is seen in Craigie, that what you have is you have a treaty formula, a treaty format that flows out of these Hittite treaties. By the way, because so many of these men are late daters, Moses was the son of Pharaoh's daughter, and during the time of Ramesses and right around 1300 to 1280 BC, Egypt and the Hittites, that are basically stalemated militarily at that point, entered into treaty together. And so it's brought up that Moses, being trained in the knowledge of the Egyptians, would know something of Hittite treaties. And Craigie uses this and Moses' Egyptian background and what he would have learned there to say he would have had this basic formula down. Now, the Hittite treaties follow a very, as I said, very definite form, where you have the introduction of the speaker, that not only he introduces himself, but also talks about the other parties to the treaty. And so this identifies the author, his right to proclaim the treaty, and the recipients of the treaty. And then you will have a historical prologue, where the Susan will review the past dealings of the relationship within the parties. And it's always to his benefit. He will talk about how faithful he has been and how much good he has brought to these peoples. And on the basis of this historical prologue, there will be lengthy stipulations. And notice I've added there, and so it can show up for you, that these stipulations begin with some very basic stipulations, okay? Let me summarize for you what I expect. These are your basic obligations. And then, what do these basic obligations mean very specifically in day-to-day dealings with me? We'll then get into some very, very detailed statements of the obligation. There would be, and once these first three parts, there would be a statement concerning the storage and reading of the document, that there would be a copy both for the vassals, as long as a copy kept by the Susan, and there would be periodic public readings of the vassals of this treaty, so they might be reminded of how great their conqueror was and his past dealings with them, and exactly what they were to do in response as far as obligations to their conqueror. There would also be witnesses, usually the gods, both of the Hittites and of the conquered peoples, who would be called to witness this treaty. And not only were identified, but by covenant oath, both would swear by their gods, so that if the vassals did not do their obligation, the gods would bring them to accounts. And then also, and usually this was placed after the stipulations and before the witnesses and the statements concerning the document, but the blessings and the curses, or the curses and blessings. How the deity will respond to adherence to or violation of the treaty. This is what you can expect if you disobey. Now, from the chart, as I widen it out. Walton says, all right, you see this format, and that explains to us what is in Exodus and Leviticus, precisely Exodus 20 to 24, and then with some further statements a little later on, particularly in Leviticus, that show us that what took place at Sinai was the making of the treaty. Then when you get to Deuteronomy, now we have a renewal of the treaty. And then when you get to Joshua 24, which you haven't read yet, you will have a further renewal of the treaty through Joshua. And you will see, though not always in precise order, you will see these basic elements of the treaty reflected within these passages. And the linchpin of all of this is Deuteronomy, because Deuteronomy is viewed from beginning to end as following this pattern consistently. It is the most consistent covenant document pattern seen within the Old Testament. Now there are and have arisen both within non-conservative, that is liberal and conservative circles, some challenges to this basic understanding that Deuteronomy just follows this precise structure of the Hittite documents. First of all, the Hittite documents don't always have the same precise structure. And Merrill brings up in his commentary that, and even though he believes there is a covenant framework, a covenant renewal framework following these documents, as he brings up within Deuteronomy, you got something that's never found in any Hittite treaty. That is exhortation to covenant faithfulness. What do you do with Deuteronomy chapter 4? That at the end of the historical prologue, to use that term, gets into now an exhortation for Israel's obedience to God. What do you do after Deuteronomy chapter 5 with a restatement of the basic stipulations? Before you get to detailed stipulations that Merrill would see beginning in chapter 12, you got these chapters that exhort Israel to obey. And so there have been questions that have arisen on whether Deuteronomy has this structure and therefore this purpose of a covenant renewal document. And now the latest work on Deuteronomy is the work by Gordon McConville. That says Deuteronomy is foundational to the rest of the Old Testament and goes back to Mosaic traditions. And is not a covenant renewal document. It is a narrative that establishes a pattern of Israel's failure and God's grace that began in the wilderness and continues throughout Israel's history and goes all the way until the end of the days, until the eschaton. And that this pattern of failure and grace after failure, is the structure of biblical revelation laid down here in Deuteronomy and followed throughout the rest of the Scripture. And of course, even seen in the New Testament, that God meets mankind's failure of sin by grace through the finished work of Jesus Christ upon the cross. And so for McConville, Deuteronomy is basically a soteriological document to help us appreciate what the basic concept soteriologically is of God in his response to man's sin that began with Israel through the Mosaic traditions, because he also doesn't affirm complete Mosaic authorship. Throughout the Old Testament, the prophets continue to talk about grace after failure, grace in the end, to use his term, all the way through to the book of Revelation. And in Revelation, what's the final revelation? Grace in the end. Sin is finally dealt with, and God in the eschaton has completed his work of salvation based upon his grace.